It's time for Ask the Dye Goddess Round 2. More and more of your questions getting answered today. Fiber Junkies, welcome back to the Color Cauldron. I'm Johanna, the owner and dyer behind Potion Yarns and host of this podcast. And if you're brand new, thank you for joining us. We're doing something a little different today though. Today is part 2 in Ask the Dye Goddess, a series of questions that you guys asked me that I'm giving answers to. Just a quick reminder that all of the questions that I'm answering today came from my Instagram and Facebook. Several weeks ago I asked just if you could ask me anything about my business, my life, my hobbies, etc., what would you ask me? And I got a bunch of really great questions. So we're going to try to get through as many as we can today as well. I've had a lot of fun answering them and letting you guys get to know me a little bit better, so we're going to go ahead and do some more today. Quick reminder though, there are a couple ground rules for this. First of all, just know I did almost no preparation for this. The idea was I didn't want this to be like a super in-depth answer to the questions. I just wanted to, if we just went and got coffee together and we're hanging out with our knitting and you were like, so tell me about yourself, and started asking me questions, I wouldn't know what you were going to ask ahead of time, right? I just have to go on the fly, and that's kind of what I wanted this to feel like. So hence the not very much preparation. I did run around and grab a couple of books and skeins of yarn to show you guys today in answer to some of the questions, but other than that, I'm just going to kind of go with it and we'll see what comes up. The other thing I wanted to remind you guys for ground rules was a couple of the questions I got asked were fabulous questions, but were really in-depth technical things that are not going to be something I can answer just super quickly. So for instance, one of the questions I got was asking for more information about how to knit a swatch appropriately and how to make sure that you're getting a good idea on your swatch and making sure that you do the best to check your gauge before you cast on a whole sweater or something. That is going to take a lot more than I can just answer in a quick little chit chat kind of a question, and I thought it was such a good question, and I get that question a lot, that I've decided I'm going to do a whole podcast episode on that coming up pretty soon, so stay tuned for that question later. Okay, and if you guys have not been here before, this is Phoebe joining us today on the podcast. She is one of my 3 rescue fur babies. I have 3 kitties, all rescue kitties from our neighborhood, and she just had her 2-year anniversary with us last week, right after Thanksgiving. We adopted her 2 years ago, the Sunday after Thanksgiving, and I can't believe it's been that long. She is a super sweet snuggle bug, so she's probably going to be in here quite a bit. So our first question today is probably the hardest, and that is, of all the colors that you dye and all the base yarns that you sell, which is your favorite color and base combination? I hate this question because I don't have just one favorite. It's, yeah, it's just the same as when someone asks me, what's your favorite color? I don't have just a favorite color. I like color, and depending on my mood and what it's being used for, etc., I like different colors at different times for different things. So same kind of a thing with my yarns. I don't have just one favorite. I couldn't pick just one favorite, and actually once I started trying to pick a favorite, I kept being like, oh, but this one, oh, but also this one. So I just picked out 4 that are right now, today. If I had to cast on something today, what would I gravitate towards and pick? No particular projects in mind, just what colors would make me be like, this is coming home with me today. The very first one is the major obsession that I have at the moment, which is my Samhain skein. This is on the Seductress sock, so it is my sparkle base, and it's a very subtle sparkle. I've sold some Lurex bases in the shop before, and while jury is still out on whether I like the Lurex base, I can't believe I'm going to say this because I am like glitter sparkle queen all the time, but I think it's maybe, the Lurex might be a little too blingy for me. I really love the subtlety of the Stellina sparkle, and this one has a silver Stellina, and then the Samhain colorway is a black tonal. So it's shades of like charcoal and kind of like grayish, and then several shades of black. It goes from like deep warm black to cool black to everything in between. It's my favorite. I used it for my coffee at the Grand Stole recently, and I'm actually contemplating a sweater pattern with this and another speckle right now. I haven't cast it on yet, and jury's still out on that, but I'm thinking about that. However, I love a good black because it's very grounding for speckles and variegated skeins. So whenever I have a wild, crazy skein, if I just am feeling a little intimidated with it, grab a skein of this And no worries, you can stripe it, you can slip stitch it, you can have blocks of color next to each other, whatever. This is going to ground and kind of soften the crazy effect of the big variegated bold skeins. I also really like it on its own because my heart has a little bit of gothiness to it, and so I kind of just love good black. And if you add a little sparkle to it, I'm 100% there all the time. So that's currently probably my #1 pick. But I have 3 others that I wanted to show you today. First of all, my Foxy sock base, the superwash, it's 80% superwash merino and 20% nylon, is probably hands down my favorite base, just as an all-around favorite for everything, because it's so versatile, it's so easy care, it's so comfy, and it honestly takes the dye so beautifully, so much more beautifully than some of my other bases, in my opinion. It's just, there's an extra depth and richness to the 2-ply Foxy than to some of my other bases. So everything is always better on Foxy, in my opinion. That's probably not totally true across the board. I'm sure there's a couple things that are better on a different colorway, but it's tough. So that being said, the La Vie en Rose in Foxy is also my favorite. I did knit this colorway for my Floozy cardigan a couple months ago, but it was on the Banshee base, which is 100% superwash merino, and it's a very smooth 4-ply. So it doesn't take the color with quite as much richness, and because the 2-ply gives it like shadows and depth to the color because of the texture of the yarn, the smoother 4-ply is excellent for showing off like really good color work and stuff, but it tends to not have as much of the richness of the Foxy. So I just prefer it on the Foxy when I get the chance. And I just love how it's this super soft pastel-y pink, like rose pink, and then it's got these like fun bursts of speckles, but it's not a real heavy speckle. It's a fairly light speckle, so it's not too terribly overwhelming. So that's my favorite because I love pink. And I'm sorry, these two together are a match made in heaven. I'm also 100% obsessed with Ancient Ritual, which is my deep, dark, moody teal tonal right now. And this is on the Dryad sock, which is also an amazing base. I just knit my Eshell sweater, the Moon Phase sweater from Pom Pom magazine, out of this color as the base yarn, and then I used a contrast orange color for the moons. And this is such a dream to knit with. I've made shawls out of it, and I just knit this sweater out of it, and now I want to knit all the sweaters, and I'm pretty sure I want a pair of socks out of this base yarn as well, because it's so squishy and delicious, and it feels amazing when you knit it. It blocks beautifully. I'm obsessed with this yarn right now. But this Ancient Ritual on this super squishy MCN is just so beautiful. I can't stand it. So I want everything to be an Ancient Ritual right now because it's such a good color. I'm such a fan of teals, which reminds me, the other thing that I brought to show you guys was the Foxy sock again, and this one is the Parapluie, which was from my French collection, and it's a little bit hard to see in here because of the way it's twisted up. There's actually quite a bit of this white space in this one, and it mixes white with black and a couple shades of teal and aqua for this phenomenal variegated skein. And I just love the colors, black and teal and aqua and white. So good. So those are my 4 favorites right now. Like if I had to pick something out for a project right now, those 4 would be in my basket. But that's not to say that I don't have other favorites, and again, it totally just depends on the day. There are some days when I'm all about the earth tones and I can't get enough of like Harvest Moon and Perfect Gentleman and Hidden in Her Beehive, some of those oranges and browns. So it really just kind of depends. Okay, so the next one is your whole family crafty or just you, and how did you get into this? So we're gonna do the quick version of how I got started. So yes, my whole family is pretty crafty. My dad is kind of the exception, but he's said before he's not very artistic or creative, and I'm like, that is such a lie. You are so creative, you're just not creative in a traditionally artsy type of way. My dad is a computer engineer, software engineer, and basically for most of my life growing up, he was in charge of designing and building these little circuit boards that went inside of computers. I don't really understand it, but he made computer parts basically. And then now he's, for the last like 5 years or so, well actually it's probably like 7 now, last 5 to 7 years, he has been working at a big company here in Kansas City that does international sales of like GPS equipment and stuff. And so his job is, specifically in his department, he designs, builds, and TESS, the radar that they use in like nautical equipment for like ships and stuff. So it's like GPS for ships and boats and things like that. And his whole company does, I mean, they do the GPS that goes in your car, in your phone, things like that. So obviously he's super smart, and his brain is really creative because he has to like troubleshoot stuff and come up with the actual design. He's not just building it, he's on the design side. So he's very, very creative like that. And he also, when I was growing up, he did like painting and building of little model railroad scenes and stuff in our basement. He builds a lot of stuff. He does woodworking. So he's got a lot of that in him. He's just much more the like science, technical build stuff. He's not ever gonna just sit down and do a painting. That's not his thing. But all of the women in my family are very, very crafty and creative, and we won't go into every single thing that they do, but my mom and my oldest sister, I'm the third of 3 girls, I'm the youngest, and my oldest sister and my mom are both knitters and crocheters. That's where I learned, was from them. And my middle sister technically learned to crochet when she was little, but never stuck with it. She doesn't do it anymore now, but she's super creative, and she does a lot of like Pinteresty, crafty things. She's an incredible baker and cook. She's an amazing hostess. She's the kind of person that will throw a themed party, and she'll like just whip up some decorations out of like who knows what she found at the craft store and around her house, and have this perfectly amazing themed party, and her whole house is decked out in whatever theme it is, and she's like, oh, I just made it, it's no big deal. And like, she's really, really good. She's an amazing hostess. She always has the best parties. So she's definitely very crafty. So my oldest sister and my mom are both sewers and knitters and crocheters, and my mom is also an amazing calligrapher and painter, and she can draw really well. I unfortunately didn't get much of that side of it. I can paint, but I do a completely different type of painting than she does. Her stuff looks like actual real things. I paint texture and colors and abstracts. But yeah, so we're all very crafty and very artistically inclined, and I totally chalk this up to my parents raising us. We had very limited, well, back when I was growing up, obviously there weren't like cell phones and things yet, or at least not for the mass market. We had a computer, but it wasn't nearly the same as it is today, and we were allowed on it, but only under supervised time or very specific times of day. We couldn't spend like lots of time on the computer. We never played video games. I still have never played a video game to this day. We did watch movies, but we didn't have TV, so I didn't ever watch TV shows. We just had like old movies. That's why I'm so into Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant, because that's who I watched growing up. And even then, we had limits on how much screen time we were allowed, so we weren't allowed to just watch movies whenever it was like a special occasion with the family or a treat or whatever. And then my parents always kept a little, it's not a closet, but like above the washing machine we had this little cabinet area, and my mom would keep her calligraphy supplies and painting and stuff up there, and she would put all the like crafty stuff up there, construction paper and all kinds of fun things. And then we also would have our own like markers and scissors and things in our rooms that we could keep, and we just had, there was no limit on what we could get into or play with in the art supply closet. You could get anything out pretty much at any time, whenever you wanted. And if we ran out of something, you just say, hey mom, we're out of construction paper, and she'd go to the store and buy more. So she was very big about encouraging our artistic sides, and so we did a lot of crafty stuff growing up. So I definitely got into knitting and crochet because my mom taught all of us when we were little kids, but it never stuck with me. I wasn't very good at it. So I put it down. I picked it back up when I was in high school. I think I was in 9th or 10th grade. And I relearned to knit because my mom was getting really into it, and she got very excited that she'd discovered free patterns on online at like Lion Brand's website and stuff. So she was trying to get me back into knitting, and so I agreed to relearn, and that was the year of the Fun Fur scarf. I don't know if anybody remembers that, when those little hairy Fun Fur balls at Joann's were like super cheap, and they were super popular everywhere. So I learned to knit a Fun Fur scarf, and I thought it was so much fun, and I loved all the crazy textured colored yarns that I went and bought a bunch, and I knit for like 9 months straight. I knit Fun Fur scarves like crazy. I gave them to everyone. I sold a few, and then I just got super bored and sick of it. Gave it up, was like, knitting is for old ladies again, I'm over this. So then I picked it back up when I was around 19, I believe. I had gone to hair school, and I was out working at a hair salon, still living at home, and I caught the flu super bad one winter, and I was home from work for like 3 days and stuck on the sofa where you're like so sick you can't even like do anything. You just lay there and like watch TV. And my mom got sick of me just whining about how bored I was, and so she gave me some large needles and some cheap yarn that she had in her stash, and she cast on and was like, do you remember how to knit? And I was like, no. And so she showed me how to knit, and she was like, okay, here you go, amuse yourself, I'm going to the store. And she left, and she came back 2 or 3 hours later, and I had the better part of a bulky scarf knit, and just in garter stitch. And I was like, this is awesome, but I'm out of yarn, do you have more? And she was like, yep. So she went upstairs and grabbed some more, and she gave me some more, and I kept going. And then I was like, so now I need to knit, and I need my own stuff. And so when I got better, she took me to the yarn store, and we picked out some stuff. And so from then on, that time it finally stuck, and I just took off with it. Oh, this is a good one. So somebody said, if you could start your yarn business over again, is there anything you would do differently? This is a tricky one. I'm sure there are, because I'm not here to say like, oh, I did everything perfectly. No, I really didn't. I'm sure there are. But the only thing that's coming to mind off the top of my head, I'm really proud of the fact that I did not get a loan, and I was able to finance everything from just investing our money and going slowly. I really have tried to like start very tiny and slow and make sure that I'm not outgrowing what I can afford to finance from the business, and that has been a huge relief because I have no debt with my business, which means the sky's the limit kind of, and it just is very freeing. I believe that business should be something that frees you, not something that shackles you or ties you down. But I also realize that's not the same scenario for everyone, and some people may have to take on a loan to get started, so I'm not trying to say that's wrong to do. I'm just really grateful that I did it that way, and I think that it's a good idea to challenge yourself to do as much as possible without a loan. So the only thing that's coming to mind that I can right now think of that I would do differently is I didn't do a great job. After I just said I did great at starting slow, I did in many ways, but I didn't do a great job of limiting my yarn bases when I started. So if I was telling a brand new indie dyer who wanted to launch a business some advice, I would say, don't think that you have to do everything. Like, I didn't offer all weights. I still don't offer all weights. I don't have any bulky, I don't have any sport yet. But you don't have to offer all the weights of yarn, and you don't have to offer all the different types. Once you start getting wholesale accounts, it's amazing how many different things are out there. It's exciting to try all these new fun things, and it's really exciting to be like, oh, if I have sparkle yarn, then people who like sparkles will buy yarn from me, and that's an extra customer base. It's really like tempting to think that, especially if you start selling well and you're like, I'm making good money, I can reinvest this in the business, and that's the smart thing to do, right? Yes, it is, but sometimes it's best to just have like 3 or 4 solid sellers that you know you can count on, and just buy more of each of those until you can get your business expand or grown to the part where you can expand a little bit better. And I think that sometimes in the past I've been so excited about adding new yarn bases because as a knitter I love variety, and I'm always trying to have everything everybody needs or wants, that I can invest too much capital in new yarn bases instead of just replenishing my old standby solid favorites. So that's probably what I would do differently going forward. That's actually something I'm trying to work on right now because I really want to add some new bases right now, and I'm trying to tell myself I'm not ready for that quite yet. So which of your colorways are the easiest and most difficult to dye? The easy factor has definitely changed over the course of my dyeing career. So when I started, speckles were the bane of my existence. I spent many hours crying over ruined yarn, or at least yarn that just wasn't what it was supposed to look like. It didn't look much like speckles. I spent many cuss words and frustrated moments trying to master that technique. I've now gotten it down to where I have a couple speckle techniques that I feel really confident in, and I love the results, and most of the time it goes super smoothly. And actually speckles these days, now that I've mastered my techniques and figured out what worked for me personally, speckles are some of the easiest colorways that I dye. So I love that they're selling so well. I love that they're so fun to create with, and I love that I personally love to knit with them because I can always put more speckles in the shop, in my opinion. So those are some of my easiest ones. And actually Josephine's Banana Peel, which I don't have with me, but is it's a white base, and then it has super bright like neon-y yellow and kind of a rich orangey gold colored speckle over it. That is probably one of my very easiest colorways to dye currently. It goes together so easily, it's so great, it doesn't take long at all, the color strikes so much faster than most of my other colors, and I love it. It's so fun, and it's a really great seller because it's just a really fun, exciting, bright poppy punch. It's fabulous. Definitely currently my hardest colorway to dye is hands down dark matter, which I don't have any right now because it sells out like that. So I have no dark matter on hand because I cannot keep it in the shop, and that's frustrating because it is literally the hardest colorway that I have to dye. Partly that's because it's so time intensive. It goes through so many pots of color to get it right, and the reason that is because I started out trying to create a colorway from an inspiration picture I had, and it was a tricky picture and my ideas for it were really in-depth and tricky. So I was mixing colors, and just all of the preparation and all of the like placing of color and everything took a long time anyways. And then it didn't go well, and it looked really bad, and it didn't look anything like the picture, and I hated it. So then it went through some more pots of color, as I'd be like, okay, gross, over dye it, dunk it in this, okay, over dye it, dunk it in that. And I was taking notes the whole time. And at the time I was taking notes, I was thinking, I'm just gonna write everything down so I know what not to do again. And then I speckled at the end, and suddenly it was like magic. And I was like, are you serious? And so I put a few skeins in the shop just thinking, well, I'm never doing that again. That was awful. And even though it was gorgeous, I was like, okay, it's really pretty, but it's like really, it's a lot of color in a skein. It's very busy. I bet it won't sell that great. And it was gone like that. And then people were like, I missed it. Can you do more? And I was like, damn it. Yes, I can, because I wrote it all down. So I dyed more, and so it is a repeatable colorway, although unlike my other repeatable colorways, it varies more from pot to pot, so it is definitely one you would need to alternate skeins on a project, just because there's no way to control the colors completely as much as I do with other colorways. I do what I can, and it'll still look close and similar, but I have some that come out just a little bit deeper color, and some that are slightly lighter, some that are more speckled, etc. But it's my hardest because it takes A, more time, and B, the techniques I used are just harder anyways. I was kind of playing around and trying some new stuff, and while I love the results, it was such a nightmare. I'm like, we're not doing any more colorways in those techniques. It's just too hard. Too hard, too time consuming, too frustrating. And every time I dye it, I'm always glad I do because it sells very well and it's gorgeous, but it makes me want to pull my hair out by the roots. So that's definitely the hardest. So if you have a skein of dark matter, treasure it, hoard it, and make it into something extra special, because I don't know how much longer I'm going to be dyeing that one just because it's so frustrating. Okay, oh dear. Oh dear, I don't know if I have a good answer for this one. What's the weirdest thing you've ever dyed? I don't know. I know one of the weirdest things that I tried was when my very first batch of yarn actually that I ever dyed was for a special project for my husband, and he wanted it to look like a galaxy, and it was based on a painting, a mixed media painting I had done of like this galaxy, all these purples and blues and reds, and then speckled with little stars all over it. And so this was my very first skein of yarn. I did not know how to do speckled yarn yet at all, and the idea was that it would be all these deep dark colors, and then you can't really speckle over like black and dark blue and things like that. So not knowing what I was doing, I was like, oh let's dye it and then speckle bleach over it. That'll work. Spoiler alert, it doesn't work. It didn't really do anything. Like, I bet if I had soaked it in bleach it would have, but I was literally like, I'll tell you exactly what I did because it did not work, so don't try this at home. I took a toothbrush, an old toothbrush, and I dipped it in bleach, and then I used my finger to like speckle it over, because I just wanted little pin pricks over, and when that didn't work, I went back in and I took like a little, like a turkey baster kind of syringe thingy, and I'd suck the bleach up in it, and then I'd like drop little droplets like that, and then try setting it. That also didn't work, So that's my funny story that didn't work. So the thing itself wasn't weird because it was yarn, but the techniques and the products that I used were abysmally ridiculous and did not work at all. As far as what's the weirdest thing I've ever dyed, I haven't really dyed that many weird things. I've dyed a lot of hair. I've dyed some skin accidentally. I've dyed yarn and fabric. I'm trying to think. Honestly, I've kind of just stuck to my lane. I've done hair and yarn and fabric. That's pretty much it. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I have dyed. well, I've like tea dyed water and old vintage lace, you know, like where you soak it in tea. I don't think I've dyed anything really unusual though, other than that. I did try to dye a wig that was not made of real human hair one time, and I melted it, so that was not fun. Thankfully it wasn't very expensive and it wasn't a big deal, but yeah, don't try that at home either. Okay, my next question is, what is your favorite needle and why? Great question. I'm actually wanting to try some new needles. I really want to try the Licca Driftwood needles, and I really want to try a few other ones as well, I think, just to try and round out my repertoire. But my favorite go-to needle are the Knitter's Pride Dreams needles. So these needles are really, really great. They're wooden needles, which are my favorite. I tend to prefer wood and bamboo as opposed to metal, although I do use some metal. I always prefer circular needles, even if I'm knitting straight back and forth, because they're attached so they're not as easy to lose. And then if I have them, I can knit back and forth in rows, or I can knit in the round. So they're just more versatile. And when I first was getting into knitting hardcore several years ago, I was on a super tight budget. I had no money, and so my best way to get into this craft was to make all of my tools and resources go as far as possible. So I like to do the circular needles because I don't feel like I have to have as many on hand. And this one is actually pretty short, which is unusual for me. I usually buy them in 32 or longer inches, well, at least 24, if not 32 or longer, because I do a lot of magic loop. And I feel like if nothing else, like even if I'm doing a little hat or something, I can buy every different size for all the different hats and socks and whatever, whatever. Or I can just do a long one and do magic loop, and then for longer projects, I've got a longer cable. So that's what I tend to do the most. And I like the Knitter's Pride Dreams needles because A, they're really pretty. Each of the different sizes is a different color. So like the size 4 that I use a lot is like a deep, like kind of foresty green / tealy blue. This is a size 6. The size 5 are kind of like a warm golden brownish color. They're all different colors, but I really like them because usually the joins are very smooth. I've had 1 or 2 where the join wasn't smooth, but I think those are an anomaly because usually they're great. They're not terribly expensive, and they're just beautiful. They're lightweight, which I really am concerned about, especially when I am knitting something big, like a big heavy shawl or a blanket or something. I want something very lightweight so there's no extra strain on my wrists. And I find that they're just really pretty sturdy. Now the one caveat is I do a lot of fine yarns, like lace weight and fingering, and I knit with a lot of tiny needles. My most used sizes are 4 and 6, so not that tiny, but I do use a size 1 and 2. I usually prefer size 1 for my socks, and then I do size 0 for some socks and for certain projects as well. So I have a lot of 1s and 0s, and I have gone through more size 0 needles from the Knitter's Pride Dreams than I would care to admit to, because when they get down that tiny, they're like toothpicks, and they're wooden needles. So if you sit on them, if you step on them, if they get, I had several that just got crunched in my backpack, like even inside a project bag where I thought they were secure, but you know, it gets slammed up against something or whatever and snaps that needle. It's never happened with anything above a size 1, but my 0s and 1s have gone through quite a bit of rough treatment. So for size 1 and 0, I do still use the size 1s for socks quite a bit in the Knitter's Pride Dreams, but I tend to prefer for size 0 and some of my 1s, I like the, I think it's Chiagu or Chiagu, you know what I'm talking about, with the red cables. They're metal needles, and the Chiagu lace are my very favorite metal needles, the only metal needles I will use anymore because I don't like metal. But I like how super sharp the pointy tips are for lace knitting, and I really like that for my socks on size 0 or size 1, they don't break very easily. They're really, really sturdy, and they don't bend. I used to have Addi Turbos. Those are my mom's favorite needles. I hate them because they're A, too slippery, so they slip all over the place, and B, mine bent all the time. I was constantly having my Addis bend, so I prefer the Chiagu because they don't bend. And they're just, the red cable is really pretty, and I find the join on those needles is so much smoother than pretty much anything I've used. So those are my 2 favorites. This next question is one of my very favorites to answer. The question is, what are some good designers that do vintage inspired designs for knitting? So I have a lot of favorites. If you're looking on Ravelry, some of my very favorites are Andi Satterlund. I'll put a link to these designers below so you can find them on Ravelry. Andy does a lot of short cropped little sweaters, and she uses a lot of worsted weight and DK, although she does use some other weights occasionally, but she tends to do a lot of worsted weight, so they don't take a lot of time to knit a whole sweater. Plus they're cropped, usually elbow length sleeves, or you can adjust them if you want them longer, but a lot of times they're designed for elbow length cropped little sweaters, so they're very quick, and they only take, like, if you're a size small, I think 650 to 800 yards of worsted weight. If you're a larger size, it'll be a little more, but relatively small amounts of worsted weight for a sweater. And they're just really cute. She's got a lot of really easy designs, and then she's got some more intricate ones that are a fun challenge, but she does a really good blend of combining modern weights of yarn, like the thicker, bulkier yarns, and modern techniques and styles and things that would appeal to a modern young knitter, with that vintage cut and negative ease that has that very, very pristine 40s, 50s look that I really love. So she's one of my favorites. Another favorite that I have showed on the podcast before and talked about before is Amy Apple. It's Apple or Appel, I'm not sure how you say it, but she's Poison Girl Knits on Instagram, and she does mostly fingering designs, and she does very, very rockabilly style. So 40s and 50s and kind of early 60s. She's done some inspired by the movie Grease. She's done some inspired by like Can Can and West Side Story and things like that. Very, again, very cropped, fitted little pullovers, and she will incorporate really cute little easy lace yokes, or she has some that are just plain knitting and just a very, very good basic sweater that you can alter lengths or add embellishments or whatever. And I just really love hers, and she tends to design with all indie dyed yarn, so or mostly indie dyed yarn. So she's a really good one as well for if you've got some fun little speckled yarns or some variegated yarns you want to use up. She uses a lot of indie dyed yarn for her designs, so it's really great to see how more modern design styles can still translate to vintage, because prior to finding her, I was finding most of the vintage things that I looked at tended to be in very just commercial solid yarns, and not a lot of indie dyed yarn. So I love her stuff as well. Someone who is new to me, and I haven't knit any of her patterns yet, but she is definitely going to be on my radar for 2019. I'm trying to decide right now which of her patterns I want to purchase first to try out, is a European designer, and I don't remember her name, but her company name is Fabel Vintage, and that is spelled F-A-B-E-L. I'll put a link to her as well on Ravelry. She has an Etsy store, and you can find her on Ravelry. And talk about authentic looking vintage. If you're more in the authentic, classy, old school vintage, not so much the like rockabilly cutesy, I really like those types of styles, but sometimes I just crave that really good, looks like something Katharine Hepburn would wear in 1933 kind of vintage. And if you're into that, Fabel Vintage is gonna be your girl. She's got a little bit more out there designs sometimes, like she'll incorporate puffed sleeves or really, really, really nipped in waists and peplums, and she's everything is very precise. Her photos are gorgeous, her yarns look amazing, everything is very, very precise and pristine and classy and like old world feeling. But I'm very attracted to her designs, and I can't decide which of them I'm going to knit, but she has whole dresses, several sweaters, little tops, and everything is just pristine and gorgeous. So she's definitely on my radar for 2019 and who I will be trying out next. I also have a couple, so one of the questions that I got was, what are your favorite knitting books? So right now we're gonna do crossover of those two questions. I'm gonna show you favorite vintage knitting books, and then I'm gonna just show you some other books in general. One of my new favorites that I just got recently is Vintage Hollywood Knits. You can find this on KnitPicks, and I will put a link to that below if I can find it. If not, hopefully we can find it on Amazon or something. But I got mine on KnitPicks, and these are designs that Bill Gibb was a designer from the 70s and 80s, and he is no longer living, but he, in the 80s, designed a bunch of sweaters for hand knitters at home to make. So he wrote these knitting patterns based off of photos of classic Hollywood stars from the 30s, or well, really the 20s through the 40s or 50s. So all of them in here, you won't find any finished objects of his designs, which is the only bad thing about this book, but they'll have pictures of the original star wearing a sweater, and then he looked at the picture and said, I bet I could recreate something like that, and then he would write a pattern using more updated So there's a lot more of like DK and worsted weight. It's not all fingering, although there are some in here. And yeah, it's really, really cool. This is my current favorite and the one I'm going to make soon. Jane Wyman's design is just a simple little fingering weight short-sleeved blouse, and then you can embellish it with whatever you want, but I'm obsessed with the little cigarettes that they did on there. I mean, I am not a big fan of smoking. I get it, whatever. No judgment if you do, but I don't like the actual, like, encouraging smoking necessarily, but I just love that little vintage retro-y cigarette design on her blouse. I think it's so cute, and it just is a super simple little stockinette top. So that's going to be the one that I try, but this is a really fun book if you're really into the super classic styles. My number one resource for vintage knitting. If you don't buy any other books, this one you have to have if you're into vintage styles at all. It doesn't have any patterns, unfortunately. It's more of a like textbook type of a thing where it is teaching you how to alter patterns, how to find vintage patterns, what to look for, the elements that make a pattern vintage, etc. Vintage Design Workshop. Yep, this is the best book, hands down. I've had it for years and it has been so helpful. It's such a great resource. In it, she teaches you about the different eras of vintage. She teaches you how to find patterns that are authentic vintage. She teaches you how to take modern patterns and redesign them to make them more vintage looking. She teaches you how to alter patterns, because if you buy vintage patterns, you know they're usually written in one size only or maybe two. She teaches you how to look at schematics. This is also a great book if you just want more information on how to fit your knits. Even if you're not into vintage design, I still recommend you check this out at the library or get a copy of it, because it is packed full of great information about how to measure yourself, how to assess a garment, how to decide if you want negative ease, zero ease, or positive ease in your garment and why, how to understand what if the pattern fits you everywhere except you are really short in your torso and you need to shorten from your waist shaping to your underarm. It teaches you how to do that. She gives you exact examples where she'll show you a pattern and say, okay, I found this vintage pattern, but my measurements don't fit. Let's do it for me. And she'll walk you through step by step all of the math, all of the charts, all of the schematics, everything. This thing is if I could only keep one knitting book for the rest of my life, it would probably be this one. It's so good. It's 100% worth every single penny you will pay for it, and then some. So go get this book. If you're into vintage especially, but even if you're not, if you're just into knitting sweaters and you want more information on how to design or fit your own patterns. Okay, and then I have several other vintage specific books, but those ones are really the best ones. Another one though that I really am enjoying that's kind of a fun, quirky one is this one called Hitch. It was a self-published, it's a cooperative press, so a bunch of designers got together and published their own book of patterns. The pictures are not super great quality, like the lighting is a little off on it, but the patterns are cute, and there's a variety of designers represented here, and all of the designs are modern designers, and many of them are modern appropriate. They're not specifically vintage, although they have some that are vintagey. Like I love this little Fair Isle hat and mitts. I don't know if you can see that. But they're all inspired by the films of Alfred Hitchcock. So if you're a Hitchcock fan or a vintagey fan, you'll probably love this book. I do. I know I enjoyed it a lot. Another book I love, love, love for knitting vintage resources is Sweater Girls. I do not remember the authors, and I don't currently own the book. It's on my Christmas list actually this year, but I've gotten it from my local library several times. I still haven't knit anything from it, but I've gotten it and like read through it and like dreamed about knitting and then never gotten around to it. But I am planning to knit some of those designs this year as well, because they're just stunning. And again, the authors of that book, I feel like they do a really great job of capturing the authentic vintage feel and altering authentic vintage patterns to more modern updated versions, but they also are able to work with, it's mostly fingering yarns, a few lace weight, but I think they do have a couple sport and DK versions in there as well. And they just do a really good job of making them very approachable, yet still very special, beautiful garments. And there are several in there that are such classic, timeless designs that when they style them with like victory rolls and a cute little vintage skirt and little vintagey looking decor, then you're like, oh, this totally looks 1940s, but you could take that same sweater and wear it with jeans and your hair in a modern hairstyle and look totally at home just in a random shopping mall or whatever. So it's such a timeless style, it fits in wherever. But then they also have ones that are very, very specifically vintage. There's a couple designs in there I'm not a big fan of. Like, I think there's this skirt and top combo that kind of look like a dress, but they're actually separate, so you can wear separately, from the 20s, that I'm not a fan of. But most of their styles are really, really lovely, beautiful. I feel like they capture the 1940s style very well. So I highly recommend that book as well. And then another one that is not super specifically vintage, this would kind of fall under just more of my favorite books. It's not really vintage. It just has an old world feel, and that is Refined Knits by Jennifer Wood. I'm super obsessed with this. She uses a lot of tonal and semi-solid indie dyed yarn in here, as well as bigger commercial companies. And she has a lot of like Celtic theme designs. She has a lot of very old school vintagey, like, I feel like they're vintage influenced, but not vintage per se. They don't look vintage when you look at them. You wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, that's from the 50s, but they're kind of timeless classic styles, and they're designed with kind of that timeless feminine, elegant quality of vintage clothing. And some of them could pass for like, oh, that could be a top from the 20s, or it could be a modern top that's just inspired by the 20s. So I really love that as well. Okay, so now we're kind of getting on more into just favorite knitting books, not necessarily vintage, but Botanical Knits and Botanical Knits 2 by Alana Dakos. Alana Dakos is one of my favorite designers. I absolutely love everything that she does, and her Botanical Knits books, there are 2 of them, and both of them are relatively short, but they have great patterns, beautiful photos, and everything is inspired by nature. So there's a lot of leaf motifs, branches, cables that look like branches and stuff. Everything is very like, it feels like you're walking through a forest, and I just love it. Okay, another quirky one, Needles and Artifice it's kind of a vintage book. If you are into steampunk at all, even remotely, you will definitely want to get this. What's fun about this book is it has little stories throughout the book. So there's a common theme. There's all the designers kind of have steampunk personas, like an alter ego, and they wrote these little stories throughout the book. So you'll have like a chapter that'll have like a little bit of a story to it, and then you'll have some patterns that go along with the story. And then in the next chapter you get the next installment of the story and some more patterns. And then you get the third chapter with another installment of the story and some more patterns. And the story's kind of dorky and cheesy, but it's really cute and fun. It's just a fun, quirky little book. I love the patterns in here. There are a bunch of different designers, so you've got all kinds of things. I've already made several of them. Here's an example of one of the patterns that I've knit, these fingerless gloves called Helms Ali. They're just really beautiful and really fun, and there's a variety of weights and techniques involved. They have double knitting, they have stranded, they have cables, lace, stockinette. There's corset covers. I'm sorry, have you never wanted to knit yourself a corset cover? If you haven't, wait until you get this book and you probably will. I mean, look at this thing, you guys. Can you see that? Look at this thing. It's so cool. So yeah, if you're into corsets and steampunk and alter egos and fantasy, you need this book. It's really, really fun. Again, that's Needles and Artifice. I think I got mine at Knit Picks as well, but you can find it kind of all over. Well, not all over, but at knitting bookshops usually. Okay, so then another favorite book. I don't even know if this is readily available, so I apologize if it's not, but I found this at my local half-price bookstore, used bookstore. It's just called Beautiful Knitting Patterns. I have several Stitch dictionaries, and I'm always looking for more, but this one by Gisela Klopper is really phenomenal. There's really great photo colors of each of the stitches. There's charts. There's a variety of stitches, and what I like about this one is it's not just, there's a few basic stitches in it, but I feel like they did a better job of finding unusual, random stitches. It doesn't have the same thing as every other Stitch dictionary out there. So I keep this one on hand because it's got a lot of really unusual, cool, different kinds of variations on stitches, and I just love the photos and how easy the instructions are to follow. So this is my favorite Stitch dictionary, although I have several. And then I have 2 more books. So another question I got on here was related to, again, favorite knitting books, but there was one in particular where they were asking about, let's see if I can find it. They were asking, yes, so somebody asked, what are some good sources for getting a knitted garment to fit you right? Well, in addition to the vintage workshop book that I showed you earlier, I have 2 other books that I refer to all the time. The first one might be a little more information than you need, so I would say unless you're going to design your own or dramatically alter a pattern, you probably don't need this one, but it's always good to have extra resources. And if you are a designer or you are wanting to just dramatically alter something, this is a great resource. It's the Knitwear Design Workshop, and this one is by Shirley Payton, who's a famous designer. She's been in Vogue and like all the big knitting magazines. But this is a lot of information, and it gets very overwhelming. There's beautiful full color photos. There's patterns in here that kind of walk you through some of the steps she talks about. What I love about this book is she has it broken down into sections. So there's like in the beginning all the basic stuff about measuring your body, getting fit, what is ease, negative ease, positive ease, etc. And then she goes into like chapters for each of the different parts of a sweater. So like you'll have a chapter all on necklines and how to create a scoop neckline, a boat top neckline, a V neckline, etc. She'll have a whole chapter on sleeves, bell sleeves, lantern sleeves, straight sleeves, dropped sleeves, all these different types of sleeves. So it's really great if you need ideas. It's also really great for if you, like I said, if you're really going to dramatically alter something or you've got a really tough to work with shape, like if you don't have a pretty standard sweater and you're looking for a little bit more of a like dramatic type of style. This book is great because she has a lot of those dramatic styles and walks you through how to alter those. So I really love this one. But it's not as essential as this next book. I highly, highly recommend Deborah Newton's books. I recommend all of her books. I only have Finishing School right now. It's amazing. She also has one called A Good Measure, and I highly recommend that one as well. It's a little more basic. A Good Measure is a bit more basic info on sweater design and breaking down like how to knit a swatch, get gauge, make sure you fit to your body, how to alter things a little bit. This one is more on specifically finishing techniques, although she does walk you through in the beginning some of those quick basics as like an overview. So they're really a good pairing together. I only have this one currently, but I would recommend getting both of them if you're really wanting more education and information and a good resource you can go back to time and time again. And both of her books have actual patterns. So she'll show you like workshops and she'll be like, okay, let's take an actual sweater I designed and let me show you some of how I came up with this design and then how you can break it down to like change it for yourself. She has patterns in the back. This one's really great for like all different types of sewing seams, embroidery, adding stuff, adding pockets, taking things away. This is an excellent resource. And what I love is Deborah Newton is one of my favorite designers because not only are her designs stunning, but she's very good at not making you do extra work just because. She's really great at finding efficient ways. I don't want to use the word shortcuts because all of her stuff is like couture-worthy stuff. It's not a shortcut, it's more of like a more efficient way, and she's very good at making you think through why are you doing what you're doing. So Deborah Newton is the first major designer I heard of who gave me permission to not block things. I'm not a big fan of blocking. I definitely believe it has a place and it's necessary many, many times. However, I think most modern garments are overblocked and a lot of times people don't need them. That's why they invented things like garter stitch and ribbing, so you don't have to block things. Deborah Newton is the first designer I found who says repeatedly in her books that she doesn't block a majority of the things that she knits. She blocks when she needs to, and she's not hesitant to tell you to block when you need to, but she's very good at helping you break down, do I need this to block? If so, how much? Do I lightly block? Do I barely stretch it? Do I just kind of spritz it and let it go? Or do I like soak it and wet block it? Do I do the whole thing? She's really good about exploring all of the reasons of why you do what you do. So I'd very, very much recommend that book. I also love anything by Hunter Hammerson. She's one of my very favorite designers. Okay, and another question I had was, what is the inappropriate fiber arts group you once mentioned when talking about your not safe for work socks? So in case you missed that episode, several months ago I knit a pair of shorty socks that I found on Ravelry, and I didn't mention the name because it's not safe for work, but the lace on the cuff, it's a little short sock with a fold over lace cuff, and the lace of the cuff looks rather like a male reproductive organ. And they're adorable socks, a really great pattern. I loved them, they're so much fun. And they have a G-rated version in case you don't want to do a particularly scandalous lace. You can do a much more simple kid-friendly lace as well. So I mentioned in there that this particular sock would be appreciated by a group that I'm in on Facebook. So I'm in several Facebook groups, but this one, I'm not super active in this one, but I do lurk around there every so often, and it is pretty funny. It's called the Mildly Offensive Fiber Artists. So you can go look those people up. They are, it's a huge group, international group, and just a disclaimer, if you are at all offended by nudes, cuss words, what my mother would call unladylike language, or rather aggressive political activism, I would not suggest that you join that group, because the title Mildly Offensive Fiber Artists is a relative term, and I think if you're likely to be offended by those kinds of things, you'll probably think that it's not so mild. But if that kind of stuff doesn't bother you and you feel like you're curious enough, go check it out. I don't know if they're currently accepting new members, but probably. And yeah, you can find all kinds of fun things. And it's all types of fiber arts. It's not just knitting and crochet, it's anything having to do with fiber. So there's a lot of sewers. I feel like there's a ton of cross stitch and embroidery people, needle pointers, whatever you call that. Sorry, I'm not good at that. But I really love seeing what those people make. I just don't do any of that myself, but they're always like cross stitching these cuss words and scandalous photos, and somebody did a felt installation of little felt dolls that they made enacting scenes from the Kama Sutra, which was quite fun. So yeah, if you're into that kind of a thing, it is a really fun little group, but definitely don't go check it out if you are perhaps a bit more conservative about it, and that is not at all meant judgmentally. Like a couple years ago, I wouldn't have been comfortable in that group either. So you know, it's up to you. Use with your discretion is what I'll say. Mildly Offensive Fiber Artists. And yeah, it's fun because there are all types of fiber arts involved too. So, and not everything is offensive. It often is, but people will just post other things that they're making too, just cool things they're making. So. Okay, so somebody said, do you crochet, spin, weave, or any other fiber arts? I have answered this one before, but yes, I am primarily a knitter. I do crochet. I just don't do it super often. I'm actually looking for new crochet patterns right now because I do want to bust out my hooks again. I just learned to spin on a drop spindle about 1.5 years ago, but that sounds like a really long time. I have not worked on it consistently, and I haven't even picked up my drop spindle in over 6 months right now. So I am not very good, but I've never tried on a wheel, but I'm wanting to learn, and I'm definitely going to keep working on that. I don't do any weaving. I technically sew, but it's very, very tiny bits, and I'm really bad at it, and it makes me want to pull my fingernails out because I just don't like sewing as much. I wish I did because I love hand-sewn things, but I'm just not very good at it. Okay, so our very last question, I know this is getting really long, but our very last question is, do you read or listen to audiobooks? If so, what is your current or the last book that you read or listened to, and what is your favorite? I do read. I am a voracious reader. I used to be a voracious reader. I've actually slowed down a lot lately because between running the business and how much time I spend on my fiber arts these days, I have a lot less time to just read, but I really do love to read. I do enjoy audiobooks, but I don't do it very often, mostly because I'm a cheapskate and I don't want to pay for the Audible subscription. So I do try to find free resources. One of my very favorite resources is the Craftlit podcast. Heather Ordover does. You can get an app for it or listen to it on iTunes or whatever. And she has a free version where they read all of her Craftlit podcasts. They do a little crafty chat in the beginning where they talk about general crafts. And then she's a knitter too, though, so a lot of it's knitting and yarn related, but she also will do other crafts as well. And then they read a couple chapters from a classic book. And so I've gone through Jane Eyre and Age of Innocence and Pride and Prejudice and several other classic books, many classic books with her. Jane Eyre was the first one I did with her, and I loved it, and so I've done a bunch, and right now I'm actually just getting ready to start with her The Count of Monte Cristo. It's an old one from way back. That's why I like the app, because you can go back through the history and find old ones from a few years ago and listen to them. And she also has a paid for version where if you subscribe to her Patreon or whatever it is and you donate, I forget how much it is, $5 or $10 a month, something like that, you get additional books as well that are a paid for only. So I don't do that one, I just do the free version right now. But I love, love, love her podcast. I highly recommend it. I love that she has a free option and it's really good. What I love about it is she's very great at explaining to you the cultural context at the time of these books, because she's a former literature and English teacher. And so usually she'll talk about the chapters you're going to read for that day at the beginning of the episode, and then she reads the chapters or someone else reads them, and then she'll kind of wrap up at the end, so there are no spoilers or anything, but it'll give you cultural context. Like sometimes a character will say something and it just seems really random and odd, but then she'll go back in and be like, oh, well, you have to understand at that time in England, there was this revolution going on with the Universal Unitarians and the Presbyterian Church and, you know, blah, blah, blah. She'll explain everything and it makes so much sense, and then you get so much more out of the book. So I really love it. I'm a huge fan of classic literature, and that's my favorite genre usually. I also really like some steampunk, although I'm finding a lot of steampunk lately is getting into just zombie books, and I'm just kind of over the whole zombie. Oh, and the whole werewolf steampunk thing. Like, really? How many of those books do we need to have? I'm kind of over that. I still enjoy some of them, but overall they're kind of like, okay, let's get past that little stick and get on to the next thing. But I do like steampunk. I love historical fiction. I'm trying to remember what my favorite is. Well, my very favorite book is probably well, I have a favorite book and a favorite author. My favorite book is The Scarlet Pimpernel. It's amazing. I've read it a gazillion times, and I'm probably going to reread it again soon. It's so much fun. It's such a great story. Wonderful adventure, historical fiction, lovely. I love it. And then my favorite general author, it's hard for me to pick just one, but I have one that I love everything he's ever written, and I can't pick a favorite, and that is P.G. Wodehouse. British humor writer. All of his books are just like light, fluffy little snacks and just upper class British parodied humor. He wrote the Jeeves and Wooster series, so if you want to know where Ask Jeeves character came from, Jeeves and Wooster by P.G. Wodehouse. He also has the Blandings Castle novels and just a bunch of really fun, silly, goofy little stories. They're short stories and fun little series. So I love P.G. Wodehouse and read him all the time. I'm also a big fan of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. By Susanna Clarke. That is a great book I've reread several times. I love that kind of stuff. And what am I currently reading? So, great question. I'm actually kind of in between books right now, other than like some boring business books that I'm reading for business. I'm actually nerdily enjoying those books because they're really helping and teaching me a lot, but they're not the kind of thing you just sit down on a rainy night and be like, ooh, I just want to lose myself in a good book. Let me read about accounting spreadsheets. Not really, not so much. So when I'm not doing businessy things, I'm trying to even remember what the last like non-businessy book was that I read that I could recommend. I actually am reading a book on mythology from the library right now, and I'm not super into it. I thought it was going to be really good because the author is somebody who studied mythology and majored in it, and then she kind of took all of these different myths and legends from around different cultures in the world, and she found common themes. And so she'll give you like the short overview of like, here's the Native American story, here's the Chinese version of the story, here's the Greek version of the story, or a similar story. Here's like the common thread is, you know, this guy having sex with his mother and then killing his father, or whatever it is that the common thread is. And so she'll give you like the short little overview, and then she'll kind of like compile them, and you get, it's like getting a crash course in mythology, so you get to know all of the stories, like just the highlights. It's like the Cliff Notes version, but she has kind of like a funny little writing style and makes them kind of fun and engaging and a little bit more approachable for modern audiences, because sometimes she'll explain some of the super extra weird or violent stuff that you're just like, oh God, what is going on? And she'll be like, okay, well, you gotta understand, this culture super glorified war, so this was like a really good thing, not a gross bad thing that he was such a jerk and went and killed all these people, but also like, here's kind of how we'd equate it to modern times, kind of a thing. I can't remember what it's called, something generic like The Complete Guide to Modern Mythology or something like that, but yeah, I've had high hopes for it, but I'm not super loving it. I'm finding it a little boring in spots, and I can't decide if I'm just not in the mood or if I just don't like her writing style or what, but that's not my absolute favorite. I'm actually thinking about restarting a P.G. Wodehouse book, and then I also always love Stephanie Pearl McPhee. I absolutely love her humor, her yarn humor writing is so good. So I hope that answers your question and gives you some ideas. If you have a great suggestion for an audiobook, especially if you have a free version, because I'm a cheapskate, if you have a free version, or if you have a great suggestion for an audiobook or an actual read, I do like to actually read books as well, please leave me a comment below and let me know what book you think I should be reading next. And if you have a great knitting book that you think I should read as well, let me know about that. I really hope that that answered some of your questions and helped you feel like you got to know me just a little bit more, get a little more insight into my personal life, my business life, get to know me and feel like a friend. I really love how many of you guys will come up to me at shows when you see me and introduce yourselves and tell me that you watch the podcast and take selfies and all of that. I love it. Please don't ever feel shy. I just had someone at a show this last month. I did several shows, and I had a couple people that said, I was really trying to get up the nerve to talk to you, and like, I hope I'm not annoying you, and they were just very like nervous to talk to me, and I was just like, no, seriously, please come talk to me. I love meeting you guys. I love seeing you guys out in the wild, so to speak, at yarn events and trunk shows, and I'm really a pretty friendly person. I'm not that intimidating, and I'm a total 100% dork, so you do not need to feel weird around me or nerdy around me, because I guarantee you, whatever weird thing you can say, I can say something weirder. Whatever embarrassing, awkward, stumbling, or whatever you're gonna do, I can probably fall even harder and stumble even more. I am a total nerd and a dork, and I do not judge anyone else for their dorkiness. In fact, usually dorky people I get along with really well. So the bigger dork you are, I'm probably gonna feel even more at home around you. So please come up and introduce yourself. But I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. It is now time to cast off. Love you.